The chair that never moved. The Mater D at La Fontana learned quickly that some rituals were not to be questioned. Every evening just before 7, the door would open, and Dean Martin would step inside with the same easy grace the world had known for decades, had tipped just enough to be polite, smile soft but practiced, eyes alert as if they were listening for something no one else could hear. He never arrived late, never arrived early, and he always asked for the same table, tucked along the far wall where the light fell gentle, and the room's music softened as if the place itself knew to lower its voice around him. "To Mr. Martin," the Mater D would ask, though the question had long stopped being a question, as Dean would say kindly, always kindly. "To," the chair across from him was set with the same care as his own lined and pressed, cutlery aligned, water glass filled to the same height. It was a chair that remained empty. It had remained empty for years. At first, people whispered. They always do. Hollywood had taught the world to see Dean Martin as laughter in motion, a velvet baritone wrapped in mischief, a man who made rooms feel lighter simply by being in them. The idea that he might sit alone night after night felt like a contradiction, like discovering a crack in a diamond. But he did not sit alone, not in the way people meant. He would order the same meal, unhurried, and then pause just a second before nodding to the server to bring the second plate. When it arrived, he would glance at the empty chair and smile, a smile that did not perform, did not ask for applause. It was the smile a person wears when remembering something precious and fragile at the same time. Sometimes he spoke, not loudly, not to be heard. A comment about the sauce, perhaps. A quiet joke. Once he laughed softly, under his breath, and the sound startled a young couple nearby, who had been watching him with a mixture of awe and confusion. "Who's he talking to?" "Ooh," the woman whispered. The man shrugged. "Maybe it's a thing people made stories to make themselves comfortable." Some said Dean was rehearsing lines. Others said he was indulging a superstition. A columnist once suggested it was a melancholic affectation, a celebrity quirk meant to cultivate mystery. The columnist never returned to La Fontana after that piece ran. The staff did not say why, because the truth was not theatrical, it was human, and it was heavier than rumor. 8 years earlier, though no one at the restaurant knew the date then, Dean Martin had learned that love does not leave all at once. Sometimes it stays behind, occupying a space so specific that removing it would feel like erasing proof it ever existed. On that first night, the Mater D had hesitated. Dean had arrived alone, eyes rimmed with a tiredness that makeup and charisma could not disguise. When asked if he was expecting someone, he had nodded. "She's running a little late," he'd said. "We'll wait." They waited. An hour passed. Then 2. The second plate cooled and was quietly replaced. Dean thanked the server as if the delay were his fault. When closing time came, the Mater D approached with careful professionalism. "Mr. Martin, shall I call you a car?" Dean looked at the chair across from him, empty, patient, faithful. He exhaled once, slowly. "Tomorrow," he said. "We'll try again tomorrow." He returned the next night. And the next. And then the nights became weeks, the weeks months, until the staff stopped thinking in units of time at all. The ritual simply became part of the room, like the piano by the bar or the way the candles were replaced before they burned too low. 2 plates, the veterans would say. Always 2. Does anyone ever a newcomer might begin? A look would pass between the staff, not sharp, just protective. "No questions," they'd say. Matters to him, and that was enough. Dean never demanded attention. He tipped generously, thanked everyone by name, and never corrected the gossip. He did not owe the world an explanation for how he carried his grief. He carried it quietly, the way he carried everything else that truly mattered. What most people did not know, what could not be gleaned from headlines or highlight reels, was that Dean Martin had learned, the hard way, that silence could be a form of loyalty. The woman the chair was meant for had never liked crowds. Fame exhausted her, while Dean lived in a world that applauded before he finished speaking. She preferred the small, unnoticed moments, the sound of a fork against porcelain, the shared glance after a joke that didn't need an audience. They had met long before the empty chair became a fixture, back when Dean still believed that being strong meant never sitting still long enough to feel pain. She had taught him otherwise, taught him that presence was not about being seen, but about staying. When illness entered their lives, it did not announce itself with drama. It crept in politely, disguising itself as fatigue, as postponed plans, as nights when she would squeeze his hand a little tighter and say, "Let's eat in tomorrow." After she was gone, well-meaning friends urged him to change his routines. Travel, perform more, fill the hours. "You can't live in the past," they said, as if the past were a place one could simply vacate. Dean nodded, smiled, thanked them. And then, each evening, he went to La Fontana and asked for a table for two, because he was not living in the past. He was honoring it. There were nights when the room buzzed dynasty, dinners, birthdays, anniversaries. Dean would sit through them all, present but undisturbed, like an anchor dropped into calm water. On rare occasions, someone would approach him. "Mr. Martin," they'd say, voice trembling with reverence. "May I?" He would look up, kind as ever. Of course, they might comment on his work. Thank him for a song that got them through a hard year. He listened. And when they apologized for interrupting his dinner, he would glance at the empty chair and shake his head gently. "It's all right," he'd say. "We don't mind. We." That single word lingered long after he returned to his meal. His staff noticed the details others missed. The way Dean adjusted the napkin on the empty chair if it slipped. The way he waited a beat before beginning to eat, as if allowing someone else the first bite. The way he never ever allowed the second chair to be removed, even on the busiest nights when space was precious. Once, during a particularly crowded evening, a manager suggested hesitantly that they bring a smaller table. Dean's smile did not change, but something firm settled behind his eyes. "No," he said quietly. "This one's perfect." The manager never asked again. Years passed. Faces changed. The world moved on, faster each season. Dean aged as everyone does, but his ritual did not weaken. If anything, it grew steadier, like a vow renewed nightly. And then one winter evening, something happened that broke the silence La Fontana had learned to respect. A young waiter knew Ernest, unaware, approached the table with the second plate and hesitated. He looked at the empty chair, then at Dean, confusion plain on his face. "I'm sorry, sir," he said. I didn't realize you were waiting for someone." Dean looked up. There was no irritation in his expression, only patience. "I always am," he replied. The waiter swallowed. "Should I take this back?" For the first time in years, the room seemed to hold its breath. Dean glanced at the chair, then back at the young man. His voice was gentle, but it carried weight. "No," he said. "Please leave it." She wouldn't like to be rushed. The waiter nodded quickly, embarrassed, and retreated. But the damage, if one could call it, that had been done. The question had surfaced, and with it the truth pressed closer to the surface of the room. That night, as Dean finished his meal, he did something he had not done before. He reached across the table and rested his hand on the back of the empty chair. It's not for show, not for anyone else, just for a moment of grounding. Those who noticed would later say the air changed, that the laughter softened, that a few people, strangers to him, strangers to each other, felt tears rise without fully understanding why. Because sometimes grief does not shout. Sometimes it sets a place at the table and asks the world, politely, to let it stay. And for 8 years, the world, at least within the warm, candlelit walls of La Fontana, had done just that. What no one knew yet was why Dean had chosen that particular chair, that particular table, that particular hour. They did not know the promise attached to it, or the reason he had never missed a night. They did not know that the empty chair was not waiting for the past. It was waiting for a promise still being kept. The winter rain had a way of making La Fontana feel smaller, closer, as if the walls leaned inward to protect what happened inside. On nights like that, the restaurant became a refuge rather than a destination. People spoke softer, glasses clinked more carefully. Even the piano seemed to hesitate between notes. It was on one of those nights that Dean Martin arrived earlier than usual. The Mater D noticed immediately. Dean was never early. "Good evening, Mr. Martin," he said, masking his surprise. "Your table is ready." Dean nodded, but instead of moving forward, he paused near the entrance, letting the door close behind him. Rainwater dotted his coat. His eyes scanned the room, not searching, exactly, but checking, as if confirming something had not changed. "Thank you," he said. Take your time. The words were kind, but they carried a weight that made the Mater D straighten. Dean Martin was not a man who wasted language. When he said something unnecessary, it usually meant it was necessary to him. He sat. The table was set, as always. 2 chairs, 2 napkins, 2 glasses, catching the candlelight. For a long moment, he did nothing. The servers had learned not to interrupt that silence. They pretended to polish glasses, to rearrange menus, to check reservations that did not need checking. Because that pause those few minutes before the ritual began felt private, even sacred. Dean finally removed his hat and placed it beside him. He leaned back slightly, eyes fixed on the empty chair. "You're late," he said softly, with no hint of reproach. Anyone close enough to hear might have mistaken it for humor. But there was no smile this time. He exhaled, long and slow, and for the first time in years, his voice changed. "Do you remember," he continued, barely louder than the rain tapping the windows, "when you said this would be the hardest part?" The chair did not answer. It never did. But Dean listened anyway. 8 years earlier, he had stood in a hospital hallway that smelled of antiseptic and quiet endings. The doctor had spoken carefully, choosing words like stepping stones across a river he did not want to fall into. Time frames, comfort, preparation. Dean had nodded through all of it. He was good at nodding. Hollywood had trained him well. Later, when they were alone, she had reached for his hand. Her grip was weaker than he liked, but her eyes were steady. "Promise me something," she had said. Dean had smiled then instinctively. Anything, she had shaken her head. "No, don't say that. Say it when you mean it." He waited, "When I'm not." "When I can't come with you anymore," she said, choosing the words herself this time. "Don't disappear." Dean frowned. "I won't. That's not what I mean," she replied gently. "I don't want you to run, or pretend I never existed, or turn me into a story you tell only when people ask." He swallowed. "I want you to stay," she said. "Stay where we were, us." He didn't understand at first. He thought she meant the house, or the city, or the life they had built between tours and spotlights. But she squeezed his hand again, mustering strength where there should have been none. "Dinner," she said. "Remember dinner?" He laughed softly, a sound that surprised both of them. "You mean when you stole my dessert and told me it was for my own good? And you pretended not to notice?" she said, smiling.
"Yes, that..."
Dean leaned closer. "How could I forget? That table," she whispered. "That chair. That hour of the day when the world stopped asking you to be anyone else." His throat tightened. "When I'm gone," she said, "sit there anyway." The memory pressed against him now. 8 years later, as rain streaked down the glass and the restaurant breathed quietly around him, he'd argued with her then. "Of course he had. That's morbid," he'd said. "You'll be back there yourself, complaining about the lighting." She had smiled. "Promise me," so he had. A promise made in a hospital room does not sound dramatic. There is no music, no audience. It's just 2 people deciding which truths matter enough to survive the worst ones. Dean had kept that promise with the same discipline he once applied to his craft. Night after night, he showed up. Not because it made the pain easier, but because it made it honest. What no one at La Fontana knew, what no headline had ever captured, was that Dean Martin had once been terrified of quiet. Silence had followed him since childhood, a reminder of losses he learned never to discuss. Music had been his escape, laughter his armor, but that chair demanded neither. It asked only that he remain. On that rainy night, however, something was different. Dean looked older, not in the way cameras sometimes exaggerated, but in the way a man looks when memory weighs more than habit. He did not signal for the server immediately. He did not begin the ritual right away. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket. The movement was small, almost hesitant. He withdrew a folded piece of paper, edges worn soft by time, placed it gently beside the empty plate, aligning it with the cutlery as carefully as if it belonged there. The letter had never left him. Not once in 8 years. He had read it so many times that the words no longer surprised him, but they still had the power to stop him mid-breath. It was written in her handwriting, slanted, precise, stubbornly neat. "If you're reading this at the table," it began, "then you're keeping your promise. Thank you." Dean's lips pressed together. The servers noticed his hand tremble as he unfolded it further. He did not hide it. He did not need to. "I know people will talk," the letter continued. "They always do. Let them. They don't need to understand what this chair means. It's ours." He glanced around the room at the couples leaning toward each other, at the solitary diners pretending not to be alone, at the laughter that rose and fell like a tide.
No.
None of them were watching him now. None of them knew. One day she had written, "Someone will ask." Not because they're curious, but because they're ready to hear it. Dean folded the letter again, slower this time. He looked at the empty chair. "Is it tonight?" he murmured. For years he had feared that moment, the moment when the ritual would demand more than silence, when the promise would stop being private, because keeping it had been easier than explaining it. But the waiter from earlier, the young one with the unguarded eyes, hovered near the bar, stealing glances toward the table. Not out of gossip, out of something closer to concern, Dean noticed. He had always noticed. He caught the waiter's eye and lifted a finger, beckoning gently. The young man approached, nervous, respectful. "Yes, sir?" Dean smiled, the familiar warmth returning, but it was softer now, edged with something raw. "What's your name?" he asked. "Michael, sir." Dean nodded. "Michael. Tell me, do you believe a promise can keep someone alive?" The question landed between them, unexpected and heavy. Michael hesitated. I think so," he said finally. "In a way." Dean looked back at the chair. "Good," he said. "Then you'll understand why I need you to do something for me." Michael leaned in, attentive.
How?
"Tomorrow night," Dean said, "I want you to bring the second plate yourself." Michael blinked. "Of course." "And if anyone asks," Dean continued, voice steady now, "you tell them this chair is reserved." "For who, sir?" Michael asked quietly. Dean met his gaze. "For someone who kept me human," he said. The words stayed with Michael long after he stepped away. They stayed with the room. They settled into the corners, into the spaces between conversations. That night, Dean ate slowly. He laughed once, really laughed at something no one else could hear. He folded the napkin on the empty chair when the meal was done, smoothing it with care. As he stood to leave, he rested his hand on the back of the chair again. "Tomorrow," he said. Same time. Outside, the rain had stopped. And somewhere between the promise he had made and the one he was about to share, Dean Martin felt something he had not allowed himself in years. Not closure, readiness. End of part 2. The rumor did not begin loudly. It never does. It began the way meaningful things often begin, between glances, in pauses, in the space where curiosity leans toward compassion. A whisper passed from the bar to the kitchen, from the kitchen to the waitstaff, and finally settled into the bones of La Fontana like a held breath. "Mr. Martin is going to say something." No one knew why they believed it. Perhaps it was the way he had looked the night before, lighter, but also braver. Or perhaps it was simply that 8 years of silence had ripened into a moment that could no longer be postponed. That evening, Dean Martin arrived exactly on time. 7 o'clock. The door opened. The familiar murmur softened. Heads turned, then politely turned away again. Fame had taught Dean's admirers discretion, but familiarity had taught the room something deeper. This was not a man to be stared at when he carried something fragile. Michael, the young waiter, was already waiting by the table. Dean noticed immediately. "You kept your promise?" Dean said, smiling as he removed his coat. "Yes, sir," Michael replied. "I will." Dean nodded once, approving, and took his seat. The table was perfect. Settings. 2 chairs, the candle placed just so. But something was missing. Dean looked at the empty chair longer than usual. His fingers rested on the tablecloth, tracing a line he had traced 100 times before. Tonight, however, his breathing was different, measured, intentional, as if he were preparing to cross a threshold rather than eat a meal. Michael returned with the first plate. Then the second. As he set the second plate down, Dean placed his hand gently over Michael's wrist. "Wait," he said quietly. Michael froze, not out of fear, but out of instinctive respect. Dean's touch was light, but the request carried weight. "Sit," Dean said, nodding to the empty chair. Michael blinked. "Sir." "Just for a moment," Dean added. "Please." The restaurant did not hear the words, but it felt them. A hush spread, subtle but unmistakable. Conversation slowed. forks paused midair. Even the piano stopped, the pianist's fingers hovering uncertainly above the keys. Michael glanced around, unsure. I shouldn't. It's all right, Dean said. Tonight, that chair needs a living witness. Michael swallowed and sat. The chair creaked softly, as if surprised. Dean exhaled. For 8 years, that chair had held memory, grief, loyalty, and love. It had held absence so faithfully that presence now felt like a transgression. But Dean had learned something in those 8 years. Something grief does not teach quickly. Love is not diminished by being shared. Dean reached into his coat pocket again. The letter emerged, familiar and worn. I never planned to read this aloud, he said. Not just to Michael now, but to the room itself. His voice was calm, steady, not loud but unmistakable. Somewhere, a glass clinked. Somewhere else, a breath caught. But I was told, he continued, eyes fixed on the empty plate across from him, that one day someone would be ready to hear it. He unfolded the letter. If you're sitting there alone, it began, then I was right about you. Dean paused. The words pressed against his chest, harder than they ever had before. You stayed. He smiled, small, almost shy. I stayed, he echoed. Michael's eyes flicked from the letter to Dean's face. He had waited tables for 3 years, served politicians and celebrities, celebrated victories and soothed disappointments. He had never seen this kind of courage. It was quiet kind. Dean continued. You always thought strength meant noise, the letter read. Applause, laughter, people telling you who you were. A ripple of recognition moved through the room. But the strongest thing you ever did, it continued, was sit with me when there was nothing to fix. Dean's voice wavered, not breaking, but bending. When she was sick, he said, lowering the letter slightly, she didn't ask me to save her. She asked me to stay. No one interrupted, no one dared. I spent my life performing, Dean went on. I knew how to fill silence with jokes, with songs, with charm. But when the doctor stopped talking, there was nothing to perform. He looked at the chair. So I learned how to listen. The letter rustled softly as he resumed reading. When I'm gone, she had written, don't let anyone convince you that love has an expiration date. Dean folded the paper slowly and placed it beside the second plate. This, he said, gesturing to the chair, is not a shrine. It's not a punishment. It's not a refusal to move on. He met Michael's eyes. It's a conversation. Michael's lips trembled. He nodded, unable to speak. Dean turned his gaze outward now, finally acknowledging the room. Not the fame, not the recognition, just the people. We spend so much time pretending grief is something to get over, Dean said. As if love disappears when someone does. A woman near the window wiped her eyes. But love doesn't vanish, Dean continued. It asks for a seat. He reached for the second fork and lifted it. For 8 years, he said, I set this place because it reminded me that what we had didn't end. It changed. The piano began again, softly, instinctively. The melody was unfamiliar, improvised, tender. Dean looked back at the chair, his voice lowering to the intimacy it had always been meant for. I promised you I wouldn't disappear, he said. I didn't. He set the fork down. And now he added, almost to himself, I think it's time I let someone else sit here too. The words hit the room like a held breath finally released. Michael stiffened slightly. Sir, Dean smiled at him. Not you, not yet. A gentle ripple of relieved laughter moved through the room, careful and affectionate. But tonight, Dean said, you helped me keep my promise. Tomorrow, I'll begin a new one. He stood. For the first time in 8 years, Dean did not straighten the napkin on the empty chair before leaving. He left it as it was, creased, imperfect, human. As he walked toward the door, the room did something no one had planned. They stood. Not in applause, not in spectacle. They stood the way people do at weddings, at funerals, at moments when respect has no better posture. Dean paused, surprised. He removed his hat. Thank you, he said simply. Outside, the night was clear, cool, quiet. Dean Martin stepped into it lighter than he had in years, not because the chair was empty, but because its meaning had finally been shared. And somewhere behind him, at a table for two, the empty chair waited not as a monument to loss, but as an invitation. The night it happened, no one expected it. That was the rule at La Fontana. The most important moments never announced themselves. They slipped in quietly, took their seat, and waited for people to be ready. It had been 3 weeks since the night Dean spoke, 3 weeks since the letter was read aloud. 3 weeks since the silence was broken, not shattered, but understood. And for the first time in 8 years, something had changed. The table was still set for 2, but the second chair was no longer empty. When Dean Martin entered the restaurant that evening, the staff felt it immediately, not tension, anticipation. The kind that hums beneath the skin when something meaningful is about to happen, though no one can quite name it. Dean walked slower now, not weak or intentional, as if every step mattered. Michael greeted him at the entrance. "Good evening, Mr. Martin." Dean smiled. "Good evening, Michael." They shared a look, one built from quiet trust, from a moment neither of them would ever forget. Dean approached the table. 2 chairs. But one was different. The staff had debated it all afternoon. Should they ask? Should they wait? Should they pretend nothing was changing? In the end, they had done the only thing that felt right. They had listened. The second chair had been moved just slightly, not removed, not replaced. Turned inward, closer to the table, as if no longer waiting but participating. Dean stopped. For a long moment, he said nothing. His hand rested on the back of the chair, fingers curling slowly, reverently, not gripping, thanking. "She would have noticed," he said quietly. Michael nodded. "We thought. Maybe it was time." Dean swallowed. "Got it." His voice came out steady, but his eyes shone. "It is." He sat. The room breathed again. Dinner began as it always had: 2 plates, 2 glasses, candlelight soft enough to forgive everything. But Dean did not wait this time before lifting his fork. He did not glance first at the empty space beside him. Instead, he looked across the table. Someone looked back. She was not famous. She was not young. She was not there by accident. Her name was Eleanor. She had been coming to La Fontana on Thursdays for nearly a year, always alone, always with a book she rarely finished reading. The staff knew her as the woman who tipped politely and spoke gently and left early. No one knew much else, only that her eyes carried a familiarity with loss that did not need explaining. What no one knew was that Eleanor had once sat in hospital rooms too. That she had learned how loud machines could be when love grew quiet. That she had also been told to move on by people who meant well and understood nothing. She had been there the night Dean spoke. She had not cried then. She had simply closed her book and listened. When Dean had finished, when the room stood in reverent silence, Eleanor had remained seated, still present, not demanding anything of the moment. Dean had noticed, not then, but later. Because people who know how to stay invisible are often the ones who understand presence best. They had spoken once before that night, briefly, politely, 2 strangers sharing the same language without knowing it. Tonight, Eleanor folded her napkin slowly and met Dean's gaze. "You don't have to," she said softly. Dean smiled, not the practiced smile of a performer, but the one he had forgotten how to use. "I know," he replied. "That's why I want to." The piano played on. Dinner unfolded not in grand gestures, but in something far rarer: ease. They spoke of small things at first: food, weather, a book Eleanor almost finished. Dean listened more than he spoke. He laughed once freely. The sound surprised them both. At one point, Eleanor glanced at the chair beside her, the chair that had once held absence with dignity. "I was worried," she admitted, "that I was intruding." Dean shook his head gently. "No," he said. "You're witnessing." She considered that, then nodded. "I can do that." The second plate was finished tonight. Not ceremonially, not dramatically. Simply eaten. When dessert arrived, Dean pushed the second spoon toward Eleanor without thinking. She smiled. That was when it happened. Dean froze, not in fear but recognition. He looked at the spoon, then at the chair, then at Eleanor. 8 years ago, in a hospital room, a woman had squeezed his hand and said, "When you're ready, you'll know." Dean exhaled. "I think," he said quietly, "this is the part I was afraid of." Eleanor did not reach for his hand. She did not reassure him. She did not rush him. She simply said, "Me too." After dinner, Dean stood slowly, deliberately, and lifted the napkin from the chair that had waited so long. He folded it once, then twice. And instead of placing it back, He laid it beside the plate, aligned with the others. Equal. Complete. The staff watched, unmoving. Dean rested his hand on the back of the chair one last time. Thank you. He whispered, not to the room, not to the past, but to the promise that had carried him through 8 years of nights. As he and Eleanor walked toward the door, something extraordinary happened. No one stood, because this was not an ending. It was a continuation. Outside, the city hummed as it always had. But for Dean Martin, the world felt wider, not emptier. The chair had not been abandoned. It had fulfilled its purpose. And somewhere between grief and gratitude, between memory and meaning, Dean Martin finally understood what love had been trying to teach him all along. That staying does not mean standing still. That honoring the past does not forbid the future. And that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is pull out a chair and let life sit down again.